Leviticus 19, let's call this one Love Your Neighbor, because this chapter is going to be the foundation for a very famous passage in the New Testament that's recorded at least 3 times in what are known as the Synoptic Gospels, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all going to record Jesus responding to a question about what's the greatest commandment in a very similar way. He's going to say, love God is the greatest commandment, but the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And that extends directly from the text of Leviticus 19, beginning in verse 18, where it says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. In chapter 19 really begins the section of scripture that we're going to talk about as dealing with the laws of holiness, having left chapters 11 through 18, which we said dealt with cleanliness. Different folks are going to divide them up in different ways, but we start holiness here because chapter 19, verse 1 literally starts off saying, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And that's why we start the discussion of holiness here. But let's understand that as we are beginning to see, as we said before, repetition develop themes, we're starting to see Jesus and his teaching begin to pop up early on in these first chapters in Genesis, Exodus, and now Leviticus. But we are likewise seeing a simultaneous stream develop as we have in the last chapter talked about indications of his enemy. Understanding that God said, look, I need you to be sure not to emulate the patterns that you saw in Egypt or the patterns that you were going to see in the land of Canaan to which you were going. The land of Egypt had some habits in the ways of worshiping goat demons that spread west, as we talked about in the description section of one of the recent lessons. But the Canaanite gods are going to be gods that are going to be influential even to this day in practices that spread south, in things that we're going to see later on in chapter 19 in the form of ritual prostitution, and later on in chapter 20 in child sacrifice. And just like we quoted articles from the BBC, I think it was in chapter 17, that talked about the way in which goats are prominent in occult practices even to this day, we're going to try to link some titles. We're going to show us the ways in which child sacrifice and ritual prostitution are still a problem in some countries today. But that's not so much our focus. Our focus is the way in which this chapter sums up the law of love. And not only does Jesus reference it, James and Paul are going to likewise write the same thing, and they're going to add some practical applications for us when in Romans 13, verse 8, Paul is going to say, owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. He's going to skip down and talk about besides. You spend enough time wrapped up in the things that don't genuinely give you peace, pointing back to something we've talked about before. If you conquer the world but don't have peace at home, what's it all worth? He's going to say something similar in Galatians chapter 5, beginning at verse 14. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. He's going to add a caveat in verse 15 where he says, but if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Once again, adding another caveat that's helping us understand a red flag for times in which our love is not perfected. That time in which we are tempted to bite and devour one another through words. But James is going to add a third caveat in James chapter 2, verse 8, where he says, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You're doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin. And what he is saying goes back to that principle that Jesus preached in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, be perfect, not in the sense, as we've said before, of simply checking off a box in Christian ethics, but to make sure that you understand something similar to this. As a guy, I might have grown nose blind to certain smells. However, not everybody has the same level of nose sensitivity that I have. Some people might be completely sensitive to things that I might not pick up on anymore. And that can lead to some very embarrassing situations if I'm going out stanky around people who can still smell just fine. So likewise, we might have grown numb to some cold spots in our heart that other people are quick to pick up on. And so when Jesus is preaching in the Sermon on the Mount about being perfect, he's not talking about being holier than thou. It is so that we can love completely in a way that everybody can see, no matter what their level of nose sensitivity might be. His best to you as you go forward in him, though.